Today I'm down in Georgia driving one of the best luxury EVs you can buy in 2023. This is the all-new electrified GV70 from Genesis. And apologies to Genesis, from this point on, I'm just going to call it a GV70 EV because that's a lot easier to remember than electrified GV70. Let's talk about the elephant in the room first. I like the electrified GV70 not in spite of the fact that it is a converted ICE platform vehicle, but rather because of that, and because of the way that Genesis has handled this conversion. They did not simply drop an electric motor into the existing space in the front and call it good. They completely re-engineered the underpinnings of the vehicle. It shares the interior and the sheet metal with the regular GV70, but outside of that, pretty much everything is unique. They touched the suspension, they completely redesigned the floor pan of the vehicle, and then of course they merged this with the EGMP electrical architecture that we find in the dedicated platform GV60. The result is that for a converted EV, we don't lose much practicality versus the ICE version. In fact, we gain practicality in this model. And then of course you gain all the performance benefits and 800-volt architecture from the GV60. Now let's dive into the details. What's interesting about the electric lineup at Genesis is if you want something more discreet, something that blends in with the rest of the lineup, the gasoline lineup, you could choose something like this, or you could choose the electrified G80, which looks just like a G80 with the same sort of grille treatment we find up here. Or you could get the very outlandishly styled GV60, shall we say, if you want to really say, hey, look at me, I'm electric. And of course, you can get that one in that really shocking green paint as well. But I like the more restrained styling that we find in the electrified GV70. Really, the only change is the grille, which is blanked out because not that much cooling is required. All the cooling happens right down there at the bottom. We have the same LED headlights with the same split turn signal theme right there, well-integrated parking sensors, and a pretty discreet Genesis logo up front for the sheer size of this faux grille. Now, the faux grille does hide the charge door. It's right over here. Let me know what you think about charge doors in the front of the vehicle. I have to say, this is my favorite location as far as convenience goes, but there are a few downsides that some of you have pointed out. If you live in an area that gets a lot of snow, obviously the grime is going to cover this charge door, but it can do that in the back of a vehicle as well. And if you're involved in a minor fender bender, you might end up crunching the charge port, which is going to make it difficult to charge until you get that repaired. Some of that is alleviated by the side door charging location like you find in the GV60. If you didn't know it already, Genesis is transitioning rapidly to electrification. After 2025, no gasoline-only models will be introduced, and by 2030, all of their sales will be fully electric. And this transition is happening a bit differently than we find at some of the European car companies, where they're really pegging their hopes on plug-in hybrids being an intermediary bridge step between a gasoline version of a vehicle like this and a fully electric model like the one we're taking a look at. So in the Genesis lineup, it's going to be gasoline or electric, no intermediary hybrid or plug-in hybrid setup. I have to admit that although this long hood profile is not as space efficient as the truncated front end we find in the GV60, this should give you some indication of how long this hood really is, it really gives this an elegant proportion. Now, dimensionally, there is one thing that does change versus the ICE version of the GV70, and that is ground clearance. The battery pack hangs a little bit lower, so we have the same sort of spacing here between the tire and this wheel well, but the body extends just a little bit lower, so we lose about an inch of ground clearance. This has just under 7 inches of clearance. Still a bit more than we find in the GV60 though. The changes out back are a little bit more modest than the front. We still have the same full LED taillight modules, still have a windshield wiper back there. Really, the only thing that changes is this lower portion of the bumper just under the hatch. It's body colored rather than having a black insert, then obviously no tailpipes. This looks more attractive to me than what we find in the regular GV70, and I kind of hope that the regular GV70 adopts this bumper, perhaps in a mid-cycle refresh, to really unify that GV70 look across the board. Now let's get to the electrical nitty-gritty. A lot of folks have asked me, is this on the EGMP platform like the GV60 and the Ioniq 5? The answer is yes and no. This is sort of an electrical turducken, I guess you could say. It is an EGMP stuffed inside a Genesis rear-wheel drive platform. So the crash structures, the suspension design, the interior, the infotainment systems, that's all out of the Genesis rear-wheel drive platform, but the electrical architecture, that has all been borrowed wholesale from EGMP. So we find the same motor up front and the same motor in the back as the GV60, producing 429 horsepower with identical power output figures front and rear. This also has the same boost mode we find in the GV60, giving us 483 horsepower for 10 seconds. Powering the electric motors is essentially the same battery pack that we find in the GV60. This is really the linchpin of the electrified portfolio at Genesis and, yes, at Hyundai as well, because it's the same battery pack we find in the Ioniq 5 and the Ioniq 6. This battery pack is notable because it has excellent discharge and excellent charge performance. It will go from 0% to 100% in just 45 minutes, 10% to 80% in just 18 minutes. It's worth noting that most of the competition will take about 40 minutes just to go 10% to 18%. So even though range on this model is a little bit low at just over 235 miles of EPA range, the road trip won't take as long as most of the competition because you'll only have to stop for maybe 5 or 10 minutes to complete a 350, 400 mile road trip. It also manages to maintain a very high level of discharge performance. So 0 to 60 time is essentially identical from about 25% state of charge all the way up to 100. And in a lot of the competition, especially the higher output competition, performance really starts dropping off a cliff right around 60% state of charge. When it comes to charging, there are two things to keep in mind. These little plastic covers kind of dangle around. It seems kind of an inelegant solution, and you have to insert the DC one first, then you can put the one on top of it back in the vehicle. The next thing to know, this is an 800 volt native EV. So in order to charge at its peak rate, you have to find a 350 kilowatt CCS station. It will take a little bit longer if you charge at the average 150 kilowatt station, and even longer if you find a 400 volt charging station. These are unicorns in North America right now. It is very, very rare to find a high output 400 volt charge station. The big network that is a 400 volt station is the Tesla supercharger network, of course, because all Teslas are 400 volt EVs. Those stations will put out 250 kilowatts, which you might think would peak this vehicle, but they won't, because 400 volts, 800 volts. In order to make that work, this vehicle has to convert 400 to 800 volts, and that conversion is power limited. In my limited testing with our EV6, which uses the same sort of inverter technology, I peaked at around 42 kilowatts. Some folks out there have said that in the GV60, they were able to get about 60 kilowatts. Any way you slice it, it is going to be slower than going to an Electrify America station. And speaking of EA, this comes with 3 years of free EA charging included and 30-minute sessions, which is actually enough to get this from 0% to about 85 or 90%. One reason to upgrade from the GV60 to the GV70 is the more comfortable front seats. These are a little bit bigger, a little bit cushier, and they're more adjustable as well. You can adjust the curvature of the seat bottom cushion, you can inflate the side bolsters, we have 4-way lumbar, and a power extending thigh cushion. We also have a powered tilt telescopic memory linked steering wheel, 2-position memory over there for the driver, but the front passenger seat doesn't have the same range of motion as the driver's seat. On the other hand, any way you slice it, these seats are significantly more comfortable than the best seats you'll find in the Lexus RZ. And really, even versus most of the gasoline competition, these seats are excellent. Jumping into the back seat, the experience is very similar to the regular GV70. We have the same sort of reclining mechanism for the rear seats. It's a pretty comfortable recline. They have minimized the hump here in the middle, and that's because they had to redesign the entire floor pan anyway, so they just deleted some of that hump. Now, they did not do that up front with the transmission tunnel because they, I guess, didn't want to restructure the center console, perhaps something like that. But anyway you slice it, lots of room in here, although not as much room as in some dedicated battery electric platforms. This front seat's all the way back in its tracks. You can see I have about an inch of legroom left. So something like a Tesla Model Y may offer a little bit more interior space. It's certainly going to offer a very flat floor and that traditional flat floor front profile that a lot of people expect in a modern EV. All models will get 3-zone automatic climate control, but in this model we have heated rear seats. We also have manual roller shades for the side windows, and you'll notice that the rear seats fold completely flat with the cargo area in the back. You probably could fit a rear-facing child seat back here behind a driver up front that's about 6 foot tall, about my height, but it is going to be a bit of a squeeze. This cargo area is a bit smaller than what we see in the Audi Q5 because it is a bit more raked. You'll certainly notice that profile right here, but it's pretty similar to what we see in the Mercedes-Benz GLC. Now it's time to answer the burning question, do we get a front trunk? The answer is sort of. We get a little pizza box thing under here. There's enough room to put the tire mobility kit right there, the vehicle to load connector. You could probably also fit the EVSE right there under that little lid. It does have a separate lid from the trunk, which I think could have been made a little bit easier. But most of this area is reserved for the crash structure. That's basically this entire area up here. Behind that, we have the heat pump system, which is standard, the electric motor, the inverter units, and of course, the onboard 11 kilowatt charger. The charge door's up front, so they just put the charger right there on top of that entire stack. If you're thinking this is usually the time where I defend a vehicle that doesn't have a front trunk, well, you are wrong. This is the time where I say, why doesn't it have a front trunk? Because we do have this long hood profile, and that's the same sort of profile we find in vehicles with a front trunk. It seems to be mainly an engineering decision from Genesis to not try and really radically redistribute things or change the firewall in the vehicle versus the regular gasoline model. But I kind of wish they had done that and maybe packaged stuff in that transmission tunnel to give us a more usable front trunk space. At the moment, Genesis offers the EV in 2 different trim levels. This is the upper end trim, so there are going to be a few things you won't find in the base model. For instance, this faux suede headliner, which I think really dresses up the interior. It's only in this model. You have the controls for the moonroof right there because this is an actual opening large panoramic moonroof. That front section opens. This rear panel is fixed. It goes to just about the rear passengers' heads. If you're tired of having an EV where the roof doesn't open or close, you might want this one. We have height adjustable shoulder belts right there for the driver and front passenger, 2-way adjustable headrests, and every version of the GV70 electric is going to get leather upholstery. But if you choose this top end trim, you get upgraded Napa leather upholstery. A touch that I really appreciate is the consistent materials quality for things like the rear door panels, which have the same kind of soft touch materials and stitched upper section materials that we find over here on the front doors. The other thing you'll notice that this model has that the base model does not have is the upgraded audio system, but the trim and everything else is very similar trim level to trim level. Those stitched lines continue all the way on over to the dashboard, where we have that strong bar that connects everything up front. That bar unifies the elements not just on the right, but also over there on the left side of the driver. Up top, we have a large standard infotainment system. It is a touchscreen system, but you can also use the controller knob. As you can see, CarPlay does not utilize the entire screen. We have the weather forecast on the other side, 2 large air vents there, and then the controls for the tri-zone automatic climate control, the front 2 zones there. Lots of touch buttons there, touchscreen in the middle, and then physical controls below. The bin-style glove compartment is the same size that we find in the regular GV70. I was able to fit a tablet computer inside. Also shared with the regular GV70 is this center console. I do think that's a bit of a missed opportunity. I would have loved to have seen some expanded storage because, of course, we don't have a transmission or exhaust system under there anymore. Over here, we have things like the parking sensor controls, drive mode switch, 360-degree camera, some controls for that infotainment system. There's the rotary controller knob, volume, tune, menu button, things like that. We then have the typical Genesis rotary shifter back here. Park is in the middle. And under that door, we find the Qi wireless charging mat, USB inputs for the infotainment system, 2 fairly decently sized cup holders, and if I open this armrest up, we find basically the same size storage area that we find in the regular GV70. They have made it a tiny bit bigger, it seems, in that area. I don't remember that being part of the regular GV70, but it's not too far removed. On the driver's side, we find a full color heads-up display. You can see all the stitched materials on the upper section of the dashboard. Since this is the top-end model, we get a 12.3-inch 3D LCD instrument cluster. If you get the base version of the EV, then you get a partial LCD cluster with an 8-inch screen and a physical analog dial next to it. The steering wheel is a thickly rimmed 3-spoke unit. There are paddles on the back that are used for adjusting the regen level, and then the buttons on the front are fairly self-explanatory. At the bottom of the steering wheel, we get the boost button, which is how we get the maximum power out of the system for 10 seconds. But oddly enough, there doesn't really seem to be a limit as to how often you can press it. You can basically just keep pressing it every time it cancels. As we get the GV70 out on the road, there are a few things to keep in mind. Obviously, this is heavier than the GV60 or the Ioniq 5 because this is, again, that turducken style vehicle. It's a EGMP platform jammed inside the Genesis rear-wheel drive platform, but it is still very, very peppy, as you'd expect, with nearly 490 horsepower. 0 to 60 is so swift, the tires are scrabbling for traction. And speaking of those tires, they are 265 width tires, so these are nice and wide, meaty rubber. Another cool touch is when you press the boost button, I also get inflated side bolsters. That's kind of a nice touch to help keep you in the seat through that boost mode. And there doesn't really seem to be much of a limit to the boost mode. You can just keep boosting it over and over and over again if you want to. In addition to unlocking more power, boost mode also changes the way the electric motors ramp up to their full power. So if I just floor it in regular mode, it goes to 100%, but it takes a little bit of time. And you'll really notice that if I stop here completely and then I just floor it. Looks like full power happens right around 20 miles an hour. It's a little bit more relaxed, a little bit more daily driving. But if I put this in boost mode, things are definitely much faster. Full power comes on the boil right around 10 miles an hour. It is much, much peppier. And then of course we get more power in that boost mode. In my preliminary testing out here in Georgia, it took just 121 feet for this to stop from 60 miles an hour to 0, which is a very respectable distance. Again, keeping in mind that curb weight. I think that has to do with the massive brakes that we find on here, and of course the wide 265 with tires. The other benefit to this battery pack, of course, is that it lowers the center of gravity versus the regular model while still giving us that 50-50 weight balance. And you will certainly notice that when the road starts to bend. Handling is excellent. Similar to the regular GV70, we have an adaptive suspension system in this model. It's a traditional adaptive damper with electronically controlled valves, not an airlift suspension like we find in some Mercedes models. As a result, we don't have that floaty boaty feeling sometimes that you find in Mercedes models. Tip and dive are very well controlled, as is body roll, even if I start waggling the steering wheel like that. This is definitely less floaty than the Lexus RZ, but the ride quality is not firm and bouncy like we find in Tesla Model Y or Ford Mustang Mach-E. I'm really glad that Genesis went in a different direction with the suspension tuning, which is something that we also see in the GV60 and the G80. They handle excellently, but the suspension is tuned towards the more comfortable side of things for an EV, and I really appreciate that. Now, dynamically, there is one thing you should know, and it's really going to be obvious if I press this boost mode around the corner, and that is that we get a little bit of torque steer. That's because we get an awful lot of power on the front axle. In the boost mode, it's going to be about 240 horsepower on the front axle, 250 some odd pound-feet of torque, same amount of power and torque on the rear axle, of course. The mild torque steer feel that we find around corners is not unique to this vehicle or the Genesis lineup. You will find that same sort of feel in pretty much every high horsepower EV. It just has to do with the reality of putting two big torquey electric motors on a car and then having all of that oomph available at such low RPMs and such low speeds. The regen paddles on the back of the steering wheel function basically the same way they do in the GV60. You can adjust throttle lift-off regen in 4 different levels. We have 0, so coasting down the road without any regen at all, until you press on the brake pedal. This does have a blended braking system, so putting your foot on the brake pedal causes power to go back into the battery. It's not just activating the friction brakes. In fact, it really won't do any friction braking until you need them. So right as we're coming to a stop here, now the friction brakes are engaging. This is definitely different than what we see in a modern Rivian or a modern Tesla. And that's why modern Teslas have very aggressive throttle liftoff regen. If you would rather have that feeling, you can engage it by engaging level 1, 2, or 3 on these paddles, or you can take it all the way to one pedal driving by engaging max mode. And in that mode, it's just about as aggressive as a Tesla, and it will take you to a complete stop and hold you there. But personally, I prefer to drive this either in level 0 or sometimes level 1, because coasting is generally speaking going to be the most efficient way to drive your EV. If you really care about eking the most miles out of a battery pack, this is the mode you want to be in. Outside of these things to know, everything else about the GV70 is exactly the same as the regular gasoline model, and for me, that is an absolutely excellent thing to say. Again, the ride quality is comfortable, the interior is very quiet. I expect this is probably going to be maybe a little bit quieter than the regular GV70 we last tested, thanks to that bigger battery pack, but cabin noise is well controlled, wind noise is well controlled as well. The rest of the experience in this cabin is also the same as the GV70. The steering wheel has a good feel to it. We have that premium airbag cover there. Right now I'm getting a massage, something that you can't do in the XC40 Recharge or a Tesla Model Y, etc. And this interior feels more premium, honestly, than we see in the new Cadillac Lyriq. And I'm surprised to say that because I like the Lyriq's interior, but I think I like this interior a little bit better. Now we should talk about fuel efficiency. That is kind of a tricky topic because I have not been driving this at home, but so far I have been oddly impressed. I expected this to be notably lower on the efficiency scale because we have those 265 with tires, and of course we have the same body and same shape as the regular gasoline GV70. But so far I've been averaging 3.1 miles per kilowatt hour, not too far off where we see other eGMP platform cars. When thinking about that fuel efficiency number, keep in mind that I have been driving this vehicle pretty hard. We've been 0 to 60 testing it, 60 to 0 braking testing it, and my drive partner earlier in the day was doing his best Mario Andretti impersonation out on the open highway. All those things will definitely figure into your fuel economy rating, but I suspect this is not going to be that far removed from the more pedestrian versions of this platform. And keep in mind that something like an Ioniq 5 actually has the most efficient motor setup up front, has less horsepower total than this, and really not that much more of a practical interior. In fact, this interior is a little bit wider, a little bit more comfortable. The cargo area in the back might be a little bit more spacious in the Ioniq 5, depending on exactly what you're trying to stuff back there. But this is just dripping with opulence and luxury and all the added curb weight, yet you're not really giving up that much in terms of real-world efficiency. Until I can get this at home to do my complete testing routine, my bottom line is pretty easy. This drives like a regular GV70, only it handles a tiny bit better, it's a little bit quieter, and it is a whole lot faster. If you're interested in the new GV70, these will be on dealer lots right around the time that you're watching this video, and there will be more dealer lots than ever because all Genesis electric vehicles will now be available in 15 states in the US. And if you're patient, it's going to expand to all 50 states because Genesis is, of course, going all electric. At some point, all the dealers are going to be selling all the all-electric models. Pricing is pretty easy because there are only two different trims to choose from. There's the base trim, which is just under $66,000 starting, plus destination, of course, and this top-end trim, which is just under $73,000 starting. But of course, this is built in the United States, Alabama to be specific, so this will qualify for the $7,500 federal tax credit, at least initially. Treasury guidance has not been issued on how the battery sourcing requirements will impact that tax credit going forward. But even going forward, it's likely going to qualify for at least half of that tax credit. And because the battery pack is manufactured in South Korea, they are a free trade partner, it is possible that this may still get the entire credit depending on where the materials are sourced from. That is still a little bit up in the air. Price-wise, though, this is right in line with a lot of the competition and, of course, Genesis' own GV70, because that does not get the tax credit. That's built in South Korea. This one is built in North America, so this one will have the credit. That one will not. Depending on the version you're looking at, this may be a little bit less expensive. And I have to admit, I would rather have the GV70 than the GV60. I like the style, I like the extra room a bit more. The GV60 is pretty compact on the inside. But what else might you cross-shop? You could also definitely be taking a look at the Lexus RZ. This, let's be honest, it blows the RZ out of the water. It's more powerful, it charges significantly faster, the range is relatively similar, but the convenience of that charging means that for me, 235 miles of range is absolutely not a problem. You can drive 200 miles, you can charge it for 15 minutes and get to that destination. That 400-mile road trip, absolutely not a problem in this, and it would take significantly longer in something like that Lexus RZ. That 400-mile road trip is not really going to take that much longer in this than a Tesla Model Y, but that charging stop may offend some folks. The Model Y will still have to do it, and it will still probably have to charge for the same amount of time, but this may or may not have to charge twice, depending on exactly that drive route. There's also that Cadillac Lyriq, which is now selling in all-wheel drive format, a little bit less performance than we find in this model, sticker price that is relatively high. And then, of course, we have the usual mainstream options, which you logically might want to cross-shop against this, and then the different size category options in the luxury segment as well. We have the new Mercedes-Benz EQE SUV. That is one size step above this. Logically, there's probably going to be an EQC SUV at some point in time. We have the Volvo XC40 Recharge, definitely smaller than this. We have the Polestar 3, probably going to be a little bit bigger than this. So until BMW comes up with an electric X3 or iX3, whatever it is that they're going to call that one, or the Mercedes-Benz EQC, this is kind of sitting pretty right in this segment along the, well, let's be honest, significantly less competitive Lexus RZ. Let me know what you think about that down there, and what would you choose if you were shopping in this segment. I think I like the style, I like the charging performance, etc. out of this, so I would probably choose this over absolutely everything except for the Tesla Model Y, which this is a really strong contender. Do you want that Tesla charging network? Do you want the faster charging that we get in this? Do you want more of a traditional SUV look like this, or do you prefer that sort of, I don't know, sock puppet, masked intruder in the pantyhose look that we find in the Tesla? Let me know down there. Hit the subscribe button if you haven't already done so. Check out the related channels. Find us on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, all those places, and I will see all of you next week.